It's autumn here in New England. There is a crispness in the air that reminds me of biting into an apple that we've just picked off the tree. I love the smell of our neighbor's wood burning fire. And my very, very favorite thing about this time of year is the warmth as I wrap my hands around the very first cup of hot tea in the morning. I love those things about fall, and I love the fall. But maybe you don't. I am well aware that not everyone feels the way I do about this time of year. For a lot of people, the fall can be tough. The days are shorter, colder, darker. And around here, we're getting ready for winter. We're pulling out mittens and hats and boots. We're raking leaves and putting our gardens to bed. And I think there's something about ripping out those dead stalks of once thriving plants and covering those once beautiful flower beds with mulch that can bring up feelings of sadness and maybe a sense of loss for some of us. The growing season's over, all that green and warmth and the fun of summer is done for the year. Ahead lies the cold and a kind of a barren time of year when the world seems frozen and lifeless. And while I'm talking about the weather, what I'm thinking about are the times in our lives that can feel just like that. Times when it feels like we have come to the end of everything good. Times when it feels like we've lost all sense of warmth, of love, and maybe even of life. Times when everything around us seems frozen and lifeless, and where there can be no hope. If I'm talking to you, please know I get it. I know exactly how that feels because I've been there. I know what it's like to feel like everything is over and there is nothing ahead but a winter of darkness and despair. But I want to remind you of something else we all do around here this time of year, something that I think changes things for all of us. In the middle of putting away our gardens and getting ready for the winter ahead, we plant bulbs. And we put those bulbs into the ground not because we expect to see a flower immediately come up out of the ground. No, we put those bulbs into the earth with the expectation that when the winter's over and the ice finally melts and the sun comes out again, we expect those bulbs are going to come back to life. Those bulbs are going to bloom and bring color and life and vibrant beauty back into our lives and the world. So why do we plant those bulbs now when everything else around us is dying? Well, those bulbs can't grow without the time they spend in the dark and the cold. That's what brings them to life. They can't bloom without the time they spend in the ground. And although we can't see anything that going on down there in the earth, the bulbs are using that time first to rest. And then as the weather warms and the days get a little longer, the bulbs deepen their root system and start to reach for the sun. Planting those daffodils, those tulips and crocuses this time of year is an act of faith that they're going to bloom in the spring. It's an act of faith that there are going to be better days ahead. And planting those bulbs is a powerful, powerful action that reminds us no matter how dark the day, there's always something we can do to make things better. Always something we can do, no matter how small. I'm reminded about a story I heard years ago about a woman who all by herself over the decades, planted fields and fields and fields of daffodils. These fields were so vast and so amazing that people drove from miles around to see the daffodils. And when asked how she accomplished such an amazing task all by herself, the woman who had done all of this daffodil planting answered simply, "I did it one bulb at a time." That's what I'm talking about. One bulb at a time, one small step forward, one small act of courage or faith in the dark. Whether you're grieving, heartsick, lonely, or just longing for spring, I am asking you not to wait, but to plant just one single bulb today. Just a single act of courage in the dark, just one step toward feeling better. Now, maybe it won't make today better, but I promise you, when spring comes again, the action you took today will ensure that that spring will be more colorful and more vibrant than ever. You can literally plant for yourself a healthier, happier future, one bulb at a time. Now, maybe the small thing you do today is listening to this episode and empowering yourself by learning exactly how anxiety works in your brain. And you know, the root of our anxiety is in our brain. So, no more wondering why you feel the way you do. No more wondering what's going on with this anxiety, this mysterious, scary sense that anxiety is something that just happens to us. No, today we are going to replace all that with the knowledge and the science of exactly how fear shows up in our brains. And knowing that can empower you to step beyond your fears and outside your comfort zone and take a small step forward. So get your hands into the soil and let's plant a bulb now so that root system can get to work, building towards a healthy, calm future for all of us. Let's begin by talking about the root of our anxiety, the place where our anxiety lives, our brain. The root of our anxiety is in our brain. And we're going to talk about what happens in our brain that makes us feel so anxious. Because here's the deal. Understanding how anxiety looks and works in our brain is critical to learning how to deal with that anxiety, learning how to ease it and bring a sense of calm into our lives. Our anxiety begins in the part of our brain called the amygdala. And when I think about the amygdala, I think of it as this little almond-shaped hub or communication center that's located deep in our brain. Our amygdala is involved in processing our emotions. It's kind of a clearinghouse for things like pleasure, fear, anger, but it focuses in particular on the emotions that are related and important to our survival. Our little amygdala works round the clock, 24/7, to keep us alive. And to keep us alive, I think one of the most important jobs the amygdala does is to receive and then interpret all the information that comes into us from our senses, what we hear, what we see, what we touch, what we taste, what we smell. All of that sensory information that comes into our brain from our senses eventually goes to the amygdala. Once the amygdala receives that sensory information, it decides instantly what it means, and most importantly of all, what that information means to our survival. When the amygdala gets that sensory information, one of its jobs is to say, is this dangerous or not? Once it makes the decision, it passes that information on to other parts of the body. Now, this sounds a little complicated, but I have an example I think is going to make it much clearer. So let me tell you about Georgia. Early one morning, Georgia was out working in her garden, having a lovely time. When she looked up from her weeding, out of the corner of her eye, she saw something coiled up near the last row of lettuce that looked to her like a snake. Now, let me just say here, Georgia is not a big fan of snakes, and neither am I, not a big fan at all. So the instant Georgia sees that possible snake, the instant that image comes in through her eyes, it goes straight to the thalamus, which sends it right onto the amygdala. The instant the amygdala gets that image, it makes the decision, this could be dangerous. And it sends that information straight to the adrenal glands. Now, your adrenal glands are standing at the ready, and they don't stop to question or argue about the information they get from the amygdala. This is dangerous. The adrenal glands automatically release adrenaline into Georgia's bloodstream. Now, you may already know adrenaline is one of the fear hormones. When it hits your bloodstream, it gives you that jolt of energy that runs through our bodies when we're afraid. Once that adrenaline hits Georgia's bloodstream, our bloodstream, it jerks us into action. So Georgia yelps. She leaps to her feet, heart pounding. She's breathing hard, grabbing her chest, ready to run for her life. Now, again, hearing all this process, this all happens in a heartbeat. It happens automatically without any help or intervention on Georgia's part. She's not thinking about it. It just happened to her. And that's exactly the way life intended it to happen. Because this jolting fear response is all part of nature's well-laid plans to protect Georgia and all of us from being bitten, poisoned, or eaten alive. It's that fear response that makes us jump out of the way of an oncoming car or run from fire. It's what kept our ancestors alive. It keeps us safe today. This is our body's way of protecting us and itself from danger. Okay. But now this is where it gets interesting, because that fear message that the amygdala sends right to the adrenal glands isn't the only message it sends. At exactly the same time, the amygdala is yelling, uh-oh, to Georgia's adrenal glands, it's sending exactly the same image to her neocortex, which is the thinking part of the brain. But here's the kicker. This possible snake image takes almost 10 times longer to reach that thinking part of the brain, 10 times longer than it took to get to the adrenal glands. So in the time between reaching the adrenals and reaching the thinking part of the brain, that snake image has already got the adrenaline pumping through Georgia's veins. She's jumped into action before the snake image reaches her neocortex or the thinking part of her brain. And it's not until that image gets to her neocortex that Georgia's actually able to think clearly, to realize, to recognize she isn't looking at a snake, thank goodness. She's looking at a garden hose. The thinking part of her brain, when it finally gets the message, is able to say, hey, seen this before? Garden hose, not dangerous, no need to panic, no need to run, nothing to worry about here. Take a deep breath. But even though George is relieved to know she's not in danger, that adrenaline is still pumping through her bloodstream. And when she goes back to gardening, she's still shaking and feeling a little bit silly at her big reaction to a little garden hose. And I bet something like that has happened to you. I know it's happened to me, and I can vouch from personal experience. It takes a while to calm down and recover from that adrenaline rush. But Georgia was still thinking about that reaction to the snake image later that day when she went to meet with a new therapist to discuss her lifelong anxiety. And Georgia decides that she's going to share the story of the would-be snake and how her overreaction had taken her by surprise. It really had gotten her thinking about what made that happen. As they talked and Georgia explained the snake, the therapist smiled at her and said, "You know, Georgia, this is a great place to start talking about your ongoing anxiety, because that reaction you had explains one of the most important things I could ever tell you about how your amygdala impacts your anxiety, both in the moment and long term, because we're talking about not just the moment, not just that momentary fright, but we're talking about anxiety that is ongoing." The therapist leaned forward and continued, "Georgia, it's really important to know that the amygdala always responds the same way to all threats, whether they're real or perceived. In other words, it doesn't matter whether the snake are real or not to the amygdala. The amygdala alerts your body in the same way, whether it's a snake or a garden hose. And the amygdala works that same way every time you react in fear or have a fearful thought. So, when you're worrying about what might happen in the future, about failing, getting sick, your mortgage, the taxes, the kids, the parents, whatever you're worried about, the effect on the amygdala is the same as if you're being chased by a bear or hear a thud in the middle of the night. The amygdala doesn't care whether it's real worry or not. The amygdala responds to all threats, real or perceived, in the same way. Just the thought of possible danger makes that amygdala shout warning to release the adrenaline, and our bodies jump into reaction, whether it's necessary or not. This response just happened. It's natural. It's, again, about our bodies keeping us safe. But even though this defense mechanism is a really important part of our survival, that doesn't mean that this reaction is always in our best interest. In fact, the opposite is often true. This reaction can make us anxious when it isn't really necessary. Georgia frowned and leaned forward and said, "So if my amygdala is making me anxious, how do I change it? What do I do to fix this?" "That's a great question," the therapist nodded. "The short answer is you can't control that instinctive reaction in the moment. And there's nothing we can do about that. The adrenaline release is physical and involuntary. No control. But what we can do is use some great physical techniques to calm that physical, involuntary, and immediate response of the amygdala, to bring a sense of calm to your body." "And how do we do that?" Georgia asked, and the therapist smiled. "Don't worry. We're going to work together to find the techniques that work best for you to help calm your involuntary response." On the other hand, the therapist said, two parts to this. That second part of your response to danger, the reaction of the neocortex, that thinking part of your brain, is slower, it's mental, and it's voluntary. As you know, Georgia, you were able to choose your response to the garden hose. That thinking part of your brain was able to distinguish between snake, hose, decide what it really meant to you, and you were able to respond. This thinking response is voluntary and within your control. You have control over what you think. Now, to sum up, the therapist continued, to ease your ongoing anxiety, to ease it once and for all, what we have to do is find ways to calm both parts of your brain, the amygdala and that adrenal response, and also the neocortex and that thinking response. Now, we can use physical techniques to calm the physical, involuntary, and immediate response, that adrenal response. We have some great, powerful mental techniques to help you think differently about things, to help you find focus on positive thinking, affirmations, things that can soothe your brain. 2 different responses in the brain, 2 different types of healing techniques. The therapist saw Georgia looked worried and said, I promise you we're going to do these together. Together, we're going to put a plan in place that will help you meet both these goals. And over the next few weeks, they worked together and did just that. Georgia chose to use breathing techniques, and she put in place a walking program to soothe that involuntary response of her amygdala and her adrenals. To soothe her neocortex, she practiced affirmations and meditations. And Georgia found that using 2 approaches helped bring a new sense of calm into her life. So good. Yay for Georgia. But now, what about you? As I'm talking, you may already be thinking, hey, what's going to work for me? Well, that's what we're going to be talking about for the rest of this course. What is going to work for you? My hope is that that's what we find out together. Because one of the things I've learned over the years, not everything works for everyone. What works for me may not work for you. I've sent people home with exercises and ideas that did not work for them, but what works for you may not work for me. Our journey together is to find the specific strategies, the specific methods that are right for you, the really best ones. And my plan is that we're going to work together to find those for you. So that's my goals. Number 1, to get to the root of your anxiety, to help you decide when and how to begin the process of easing that anxiety, and to finally help you choose the right techniques to get you started on your way. And let me say, I have designed and compiled an entire roster of anxiety-busting techniques in my book, Calm and Sense. I hope to share with you here some of the very best, most effective techniques from that book. I'm so excited about being able to bring them to you here. So let's wrap up. Now we have some understanding about how fear happens in our brain, and maybe that there are going to be some wonderful things we can do about it. In our next module, we're going to take a look at one of the reasons why women are 60% more likely to experience anxiety disorders than our male counterparts. I think you're going to be really surprised.